Hey guys, it's Chelsea from The Financial Diet, and this week's video is sponsored by SoFi. And something we talk about quite a lot on this channel is the importance of knowing what tools and resources you have at your disposal when you're trying to put your best financial foot forward and make the best decisions for you. Half the battle is just knowing what's available to us. And on that note, thanks to SoFi for supporting TFD. With the student repayment pause ending on December 21st, refinancing your loans could help you save thousands and allow you to shift back into your repayment plan. We know that navigating the sphere of student loans can be a lot to manage, but with the help of refinancing through SoFi, you can focus on achieving financial goals in other parts of your life. At TFD, we believe that being well-informed when it comes to your student loans is essential. SoFi understands that returning to making payments is a source of anxiety for many folks, which is why SoFi has committed to paying off up to $100,000 in student loan debt for 10 people, up to $1 million total. If you refinance with SoFi before the end of the year, you're automatically entered for a chance to have your student loans paid off. And SoFi's Forget Your Debt sweepstakes is a special opportunity to remember to refinance if it's the right option for you. And even if you don't win, you'll potentially save thousands in the long run. With SoFi, there are no fees, and you'll save thousands of dollars thanks to flexible terms and low fixed or variable rates starting at 3.74% APR with auto pay for federal borrowers. SoFi also offers member benefits such as financial advice, career coaching, and more, all at no cost. Enter by Sunday, December 31st, 2022 for a chance to win. Click the link at sofi.com/million in our description box to enter the Forget Your Student Debt sweepstakes, and you could win up to $100K toward your loans to help you forget about student debt if you refi today. Terms and conditions apply, void where prohibited. And today I'm here in my black turtleneck, I'm smoking a cigarette, an invisible cigarette, and we're going to talk about my years living in France. Specifically, we're going to talk about the things that I totally changed my mind on since living out of the United States. And for me, it just so happened that I lived for several years in France, and I spend a lot of every year kind of since then in France and with French people and just getting that secondhand and sometimes firsthand French smoke. And I just want to start this video by saying, because I know this is often a controversial subject in the sense of, America's not a monolith. Europe's not a monolith. The rest of the world's not a monolith. I agree. Even I'm not a monolith. Nothing's a monolith. And it would be completely disingenuous to say that America is universally one way about all of these issues and all of one country, in my case France, let alone all of a continent or the rest of the world is another way. That's often not true. There's a lot of blurred lines. And much of what I loved about living in Europe are things that I enjoy in New York City and are part of the reason why I really want to live here for the long haul. So it's definitely achievable in both. And I just want to make a disclaimer that I love America. I bought a home here. I built a company here. I made wonderful friends here. I didn't meet my husband, but I got married here. And I plan to be here for a long time. And a lot of what I've accomplished, I don't necessarily think would have been possible in another place. So this is not to shit on America. It's more to just take a slightly more critical lens at the things that I sort of took for granted as normal or universal before living outside of the country, which I really changed my mind on since doing so. So without further ado, let's get into the points. Really putting my theater training to use here. Number one, and this is a topic that I've talked about a little bit on the channel before. It's also certainly something that I've talked about in my personal life, including with the person sitting behind the camera. So she's going to be no stranger to this discourse, but it's what I refer to as feast and famine culture, which I think is very, very prevalent in the United States and quite a bit less prevalent in a lot of other countries, notably in the country where I lived. What I mean by this is the tendency to overindulge and then cut back as kind of not just a way of eating or drinking or partying or traveling or really any indulgence, but sort of as a way of being and looking at the world. Now, I should really clarify this by saying that in doing the research for this video, when I was looking up things like average French diets, alcohol consumption, etc., if you even Google the vaguest terms around French diet, you are mostly just going to be inundated with articles and books and podcasts and shit about why French women don't get fat, more or less. I want to say here up front that that is not true on the whole. There are plenty of women in France of all sizes. They are just not represented in their culture and media and are generally stigmatized a lot more than heavier people are in the US. But also this is one where I really got to give big ups to America in the sense that I do believe America, with all its flaws, is a much more body positive culture. And though we definitely have a lot of health issues that we need to deal with as a culture, some of which I'll discuss, I also think that in general, the stigmatization population around even deviating slightly from the norm in terms of body is way lower. I mean, just in general, like in France, you are very much expected as a woman to not just be in good health and shape, but explicitly thin. And there are tons of problematic, habits and norms and cultural issues around that I'm not going to get into now, but I definitely hear, and even just Googling these terms and seeing all those articles about why French women don't get fat, more than a little triggering, quite frankly. There's also apparently a TikTok that's been going around with the same subject that has also been thoroughly dragged. So I guess power to the people for reining that discourse in. So that all being said, those are a lot of disclaimers, but even just on an anecdotal level, and this is backed up by the data, which I will link in the description, one of the things that I very rarely saw while living in France that I see all the time in the US, both as a younger person and now, is a culture of binging and restriction, almost as a norm. We see this a lot in America with drinking alcohol particularly. Although some countries drink more than the US on average, the US has a pretty staggering tendency to binge drink, which in many ways is often the most unhealthy form of alcohol consumption. Similarly, there is a very prevalent culture of sort of overindulging and then hyper-restriction when it comes to eating habits, specifically around eating very calorically dense and nutritionally deficient food. Obviously, a very clear example of this is things like the massive tendency to overeat around the holidays, followed by the popularity of things like Whole30 or other crash diets in the new year. But what's undeniable is that as a culture, we do have a tendency to overindulge and then to really punish ourselves for it, or to look at the overindulgence itself as a sort of reward that we have to earn or an escape from our day-to-day life. Think things like the wine mom culture, or framing around eating hyper-processed foods as being naughty or being bad. Now, I have a whole working theory that this is a relic of puritanical roots and it has strong Calvinist energy, and there's just a whole lot of weird religious shit that we're still kind of shaking off as a culture, but it has a really heavy burden on how we even view the very concept of pleasure and joy and satisfaction in our culture. We tend to view it through the lens of sin or something that we have to compensate or castigate ourselves about. We're being relentlessly marketed to consume things that are maybe not great for us. And many of us live in food deserts or work such long hours or have so little resources that basically the only things available to us are unhealthy choices. And yet we feel that we should constantly be on a cycle of punishing ourselves for having made them. It's something that I've struggled with a lot in life, is finding kind of what is a good litmus test to assure that I'm neither overindulging in a way that's overall detrimental to my health and well-being, nor am I restricting or punishing myself in a way that is honestly more moral than even reasonable. My personal goal when it comes to any indulgence in life is to live in such a way that I never feel guilty about what I ate or what I drank or how late I stayed up or really any other choice that I make at a given moment. I focus on living a life that's overall healthy and balanced and active and nutritious and productive, and the pleasures that I weave throughout my life are there to enhance the experience of it without being something that I need to apologize or punish myself for, because I'm not overdoing it in the moment, and I know that there will be more joyful moments on the horizon to come. This is very similar to the framing of intuitive eating, for example, where you're rarely binging things because you know that there's always more, and that you're focusing more on the joy rather than the diminishing returns of overindulging. It's not a perfect science, but I can say for the most part that I very rarely wake up and feel bad about what I ate or what I did, because I know that overall I'm living a life that I feel good in my body and good in my mind. And this dividing up and balancing out of pleasures is something that I really did genuinely see and continue to see happen in Europe in a way that I just don't see happening as much in America. And it's something I think we can all learn from. Number 2, and listen, talk about no surprises, I'm gonna drag car culture again. I, before moving to France, was one of the majority of Americans who drove everywhere. I had cars, I paid the insurance, I paid the gas, there were technically buses where I lived, but I didn't even think of taking them because what the kind of loser takes a bus? And I genuinely was unable to picture a version of my life which didn't involve cars, even though I never really liked driving, got in a lot of accidents, and generally had a pretty bad relationship with being on the road. But as I point out in this tweet, and yes, I'm self-promoting a tweet here, it's interesting to note that while Americans on the whole are very much victim to the overall car culture and all that it entails, and we'll discuss that in a second, when it comes to our leisure experiences, we tend to seek out environments that are charming and enjoyable and fulfilling because they're devoid of or at least minimizing cars. And as someone who went from never being able to picture life without a car to someone who has not driven in 10 years and now rides a bike everywhere in New York City, I can fully say that all of these paradigms that we have in our mind about what life needs to be and how it should be lived are very capable of shifting. We just have to have an impetus to shift them. And for me, it wasn't until I moved to a society that was so robust when it came to things like public transit, pedestrian infrastructure, walkability, amazing train travel that allows you to go basically anywhere on the continent for very little money in a very efficient way, that I realized that there was a better way to live. And I actually looked into the extent to which car culture isn't just bad for the environment, it's bad for the American soul. As The Guardian put it, there are also subtler and more pervasive effects of car culture. Traffic mutes community as the noise, danger, and pollution in busy streets drives people indoors. And the places in which children could play and adults could sit and talk are reserved instead for parking. Engine noise, a great but scarcely acknowledged cause of stress and illness, fills our lives. As we jostle to secure our road space, as we swear and shake our fists at other drivers, pedestrians, and cyclists, as we grumble about speed limits and traffic calming, cars change us, enhancing our sense of threat and competition and cutting us off from each other. We have talked a lot on this channel about how particularly atomized Americans are socially as they get older compared to other countries and cultures. And a huge part of that is because Americans just live really far from each other, and they don't have passive opportunities to cross each other in the street because they're not walking to anything. They're not just passively strolling by. They're not dining al fresco, which is how people easily and passively stay connected. And as someone who used to think that taking the bus was like a deranged thing to do and couldn't imagine it, I now take public transit literally everywhere that I'm not walking or biking. And I've only because of that shift been able to realize what studies have borne out to be true, which is that good public transportation actually makes people happier. University of Minnesota transport policy scholar Jason Cow performed a study in which Cow found that proximity to good public transit is significantly associated with increased well-being. People who live near rail lines are happier with their lives. And when it comes to the other form of transportation, your own damn legs, walking can be as good a workout, if not better, than running, says Dr. Matt Tannenberg, CSCS, a sports chiropractor and certified strength and conditioning specialist in Phoenix, Arizona, who works with elite athletes. The benefits associated with just walking a lot in a very sort of passive, everyday, low-impact way cannot be overstated. It is heavily associated with things like reported quality of life, longevity, happiness, and so on. Also, it just freaking feels good. And you get to feel like Belle every day. I'm just like walking past my butcher, past my florist, past my bookseller. What have you on your shelves for me today? And on the note of strolling passively through your community in a very perky way, the third thing I really changed my mind about was the community versus individual dichotomy. Now, this is where I'm gonna get really, really real and vulnerable with you guys and admit one of the most embarrassing facts about me, which was that in the lead up to moving to France from the ages of about like 19 to 21-ish, I was a very hardcore libertarian. I was a libertarian girly. Now listen, there's no excuse. I understand that. But in the late aughts, depending on what type of dude you dated, the chances of getting exposed to like an Ayn Rand, Ron Paul combo were really high. Like I dated a jam band dude, I dated kind of a goth dude, and I dated a libertarian dude, and it stuck. I was all about, you know, hashtag logic, hashtag reason, hashtag the supreme individual, hashtag Ron Paul 08, Ron Paul 2020, Ron Paul 2024, like I guess he can still pull it out. He's probably 107 at this point. But anyway, I was really lost in the sauce when it came to my youthful libertarianism, and I regret it. And it's kind of ironic that at the peak of my sort of self-proclaimed libertarianism, and I sometimes do go back to those like blog posts, which that blog is very privated, you guys can't find it, and shudder at the person I was and the way I was thinking, that I moved to a society that is objectively way, way less libertarian than basically anywhere in the United States. And I have to say, it truly and profoundly changed my mind when it came to what I now look back on as an incredibly false and misleading dichotomy between the self / the all-powerful individual and the community. Ultimately, I think it's very naive to not acknowledge that human beings, by their very nature, are community-minded animals. They are a part of their community. They're an extension of their community. They live and die by their communities. And with the very rare exception of like off-grid weirdos who are like stockpiling canned food and guns, and even they are dependent on society in many ways, we can't live and thrive without each other. And if the pandemic taught us anything, it's that if the community catches a cold, we get sick. and vice versa. The community is just a collection of individuals, and when it comes to things like ensuring social safety nets, reducing wealth inequality, protecting the most vulnerable in a given community, and improving quality of life for people even if it doesn't directly impact you and your own family, life is just so much better when you think about not just who you are as a person, but how you fit into and uplift the community in general. Now, obviously, the libertarian aspect of it is a much more sort of like right-wing political movement, but even in like, for example, the sort of self-carification of internet therapy that I've talked more and more about on this channel, I think there's also a hyper-individualism that's creeping into so-called progressive spaces. The obsession of the self is a very, very fundamental mindset that plagues Americans to our detriment, and it can infiltrate basically any kind of ideology. Being self-obsessed for like Instagram therapy self-care reasons, in my opinion, can be just as detrimental for being self-obsessed for libertarian doomer reasons. At the end of the day, it's just two sides of the same, unfortunately quite American coin, which is thinking that you can extract the individual from the community, which you can't. And going back to a more logistical point similar to driving, something I definitely got unplugged from the matrix about when it came to living outside of America was living in small spaces. I was living in the suburban US with roommates before I moved to France. We lived in a large house. It had a pool. I had a big room. I had my own bathroom. We had tons of space per resident. We had a multi-car garage, and even that I sometimes found cramped. And then I moved to France, where I was living in studio apartments and was definitely radically downsizing in basically every aspect of my life, and yet I felt a lot better. One thing that really cannot be denied when it comes to the American way of living is that as our families have gotten smaller, the space that we take up has gotten bigger. Now, this is obviously terrible for the environment because more square footage just means consuming more resources and filling it with more unnecessary junk, but it's also bad for us psychologically. It contributes to all the problems we talked about before, like the social atomization and distance from neighbors and removal from community. We're basically turning everyone's home into a castle, and what sucks about a castle is that you really can't leave it because everything outside of it is hostile. The average newly built home in America today offers more than 2,600 square feet, and the shrinking nuclear family means that that works out to about 1,000 square feet per person. As of 2012, 4 in 10 homes were built with at least 4 bedrooms, and more than 9 in 10 had at least 2 bathrooms. The most obvious cost of living large is the literal cost. Adjusted for inflation, new homes have cost about $110 per square foot since 1973. That means in real dollars that the average new home today costs more than twice what the average new home cost half a century ago. Energy bills are also higher too, as efficiency gains brought by modern building technology are lost in larger homes. More than doubling your housing bill will take an enormous toll on every other part of your financial life. And that's not even getting into furnishing the because who has not been into a suburban home in America and seen like multiple rooms that are unused, if not sometimes unfurnished? So ever since that part of my life, I've lived in much smaller spaces and have frankly never looked back. If you were to divide our home square footage by the number of residents, not including our 8-pound dog, my husband and I each get about 425 square feet of living space, which is more than enough for me. Lastly, and this one is perhaps a slightly more positive note to end on, something that I changed my mind about in a way that I'm truly, truly grateful that I had this experience, because I really can't even count the ways in which it has positively impacted my life. And that is I changed my mind about my fear of aging as a woman. Now, I won't lie, it's not perfect in France. Certainly not. There is still a lot of fear of aging. There's still a lot of upholding of youth as a paradigm. It is definitely still a problem. And I'm still a human being subject to all of the whims and caprices and judgments of the society around me. So yes, I do still have some anxieties around getting older. Inevitable. But I think I would have gone down a very, very different path with my own insecurities were I not to have had the experience that I did and seen the culture that I saw. So for context, as some of you may know, I made the decision several years ago to only follow influencers over a certain age, mostly over 50, that varies a little bit, but mostly over 50. And that has done in and of itself untold wonders for my mental health in terms of normalizing the aging process and seeing women living their best life at all stages of their life, getting second chances. Some of these women are like divorced or widowed and are like living it up and starting new careers and seeing their children leave the nest and all of this great stuff. It's very, very empowering. But even if you look at the numbers in terms of the way that we treat aging in these respective cultures. Things like the adherence to certain cosmetic procedures and other physical alterations that are meant to preserve and prioritize youth are just way more popular in the US because we do have a much more youth-obsessed culture. I mean, everyone's seen those memes about like Leonardo DiCaprio and his girlfriends or Tom Cruise and his leading ladies. And when I lived in France, it really struck me how often on the television shows I would watch or in the movies I would go see in the theaters, or on the covers of magazines even, I would see older women. I would see women with wrinkles. I would see women with gaps in their teeth and visible sunspots or freckles and imperfections and gray hairs. And they were still viewed as vibrant and interesting and beautiful and sexy and relevant and worth listening to. You just see a natural process of women aging in a much, much more prevalent way than you do in the US, especially when it comes to media and pop culture. And there are really bad beauty standards. And like I said earlier, the pressure to be thin in France far outweighs, no pun intended, the pressure to be thin in the US. And that's bad. But at the very least, there is a visibility to women as they age, both just generally and also in a more natural and visibly having aged way than there is in the US. And I think that's something really to aspire to. I love that when I go back to France and turn on the TV and watch just random talk shows or series, that I'm very likely to see a lot of women looking great and living their best lives who also look like 50-something women or however old they are. It was a mindset shift that has filtered through so many aspects of my life, and I feel genuinely grateful for having experienced. And if I could leave you guys with one thought on that note, it's that all of the things that we tend to valorize about other cultures, first of all, are not universals. There's going to be variation in every culture, and that thing that we're idolizing is also going to exist in the US as well. But another important thing to remember is most of them, with the exception of things like, let's say, the social safety nets we don't have, which are bigger issues we address in other videos, will often come down to mindset shifts, will come down to habit shifts, will come down to how much we think that we need, or how we think we need to get around, or what we think we need to look like, or the life that we think that we need to live. Not all of this, but some of this is genuinely optional. And that charming European vacation that you've taken that you felt like, oh wow, I wish life could be like that every day, maybe it can't in literally every way, but it certainly can in some ways. And many of those changes are honestly even free to make or will save you money in the longer term. Worth thinking about. And if you want to hear more about some of the really unhealthy and insidious mindsets that we have in the US all around our lifestyles and our productivity and our quest for success, this month's members only video is all about that sort of hustle success advice that is actually making our lives way worse. You can see a little clip here, and that video will be out next week. And if you want to be sure to watch it when it comes out, you will just want to hit the join button and join our society at the $4.99 a month tier. Both hustle culture generally, but also the personal finance media bubble, have been a bit of a breeding ground over the past 10 years for advice that isn't just bad on a technical level, but also profoundly damaging to us on a personal level. And these range from day-to-day sort of productivity habits to long-term investment advice. So because we got a fair amount to get into, let's dive into 6 pieces of success advice that are actually terrible for you. As always, guys, thank you for watching. And don't forget to hit the subscribe button and to come back every Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday for new and awesome videos. Goodbye.